A miracle cure for pain, a hidden cost of war. During the Civil War, opium promised relief for shattered bodies and minds, but it left countless veterans chained to lifelong addiction. While a nation healed, its soldiers carried the poison home. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, joined by my well-read co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
And we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And we have a particularly wild subject to talk about today, right, Lynn?
We do. Yes, we're very excited to have Dr. Jonathon S. Jones, historian and assistant professor of history at James Madison University. And his book, which is coming up in October, is called Opium Slavery, Civil War Veterans and America's First Opioid Crisis. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's an absolutely fascinating topic, and it was also your dissertation topic. So I'm just interested in how you came to the topic, because as someone who had to figure out a dissertation topic, I'm just always interested in the process people go through. And usually it's just a complete accident that they come across their topic. But is that how it was for you?
Yeah, kind of a cliche, right? Sometimes it's true, though. It started out as a totally separate research project before I was even working on a PhD program. I was working on like a master's kind of thesis paper,
Mhm.
and I kept finding it was about Civil War veterans, and I was kind of going through some hospital records, and I kept finding like cases of people that were described kind of euphemistically as being morphine users. And so I kind of like filed that away. I took a break from school, and when I came back and it was time to pick a dissertation topic, I could not get that out of my brain. And so that's kind of where the direction that I went, and it really did sort of snowball almost out of control from there. I think one of the things that I also had kind of in the back of my mind was the ongoing opioid crisis, which was really heavily in the news right around the time that I started sitting down to do some research and writing for the dissertation. And so that was another kind of influence. So accident and the news kind of came together for me.
The perfect storm.
Yeah.
And I can see why it was an engaging topic to get into, because it makes sense, but it's not something that I've seen talked about very often,
Mhm.
in either academic or, general history fan circles. But it makes sense that people were using morphine at the time, because in my head, what I associate for like Civil War medical practices is when you got shot, they just sawed off a limb, called it a day. And that
Yeah.
was kind of like, bite on this.
Yeah.
And the
Enjoy.
fact that there's so many Civil War books, and you had a really great comparison of how many Civil War books are written, and if you remember it, you can say it. And the fact that that many books have been written and are still being written, and yet nobody's has talked about this topic. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, it's really, that was one of the things that also kind of drew my interest. There have actually been more books published about the Civil War than the number of days that have passed since the end of the Civil War. And the rate of, it's crazy. And the rate of book publishing about the topic is getting like more and more and more rapid. So, and that
Really?
doesn't even include like the articles and the websites and the podcasts, the movies, the TV shows. It's like really, really, it is kind of the most well documented period of US history, maybe rivaled only by like World War II. But it's still, we still kind of continue to find these areas where we don't know as much as we thought we might know, or areas where we've overlooked something that it turns out to be kind of important. And that was kind of the case with this topic. A lot of scholars have written about opium and opioids, kind of like in today's context. Also thinking about like in the kind of 1800s, the context of like the British opium wars and things like that. And so it makes sense, right, when you think about those things, that the Civil War would have also fueled a lot of opium and morphine consumption, but it's not something that had really been squarely studied by very many scholars before, like in a very serious way.
So before we get into the weeds of all this, can you just describe what the difference between opium and
Mm.
morphine is for those of us who don't know? I definitely do.
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of blew my mind a little bit, and so um, but it's also something that it's worth kind of sitting back and thinking about for a moment. So opium is a plant. So it's an
Hmm.
opium poppy. The plant is still grown all over the world today, but especially in places like Afghanistan, where it's still a major crop. And if you do some things to the opium poppy after you harvest some of the juices that come out of it, you can turn it into a drug called opium. So there's opium poppy, the plant, opium, the drug. And then, if you do some other things, there's some chemistry involved, combining with different other kinds of ingredients. You can get derivatives of opium like morphine. And so, collectively, opium, the drug, morphine, and a few other substances that were known in the 19th century, like laudanum, which is opium mixed with alcohol. So you can imagine kind of the attractiveness of that drug, right? Those are all collectively called opiates.
Hmm.
And so that's a term that a lot of folks are familiar with, like opiate medicines.
Right.
There's another term, though, to kind of throw even more of a wrench in there that we've all heard of, and that is opioids. And those are just synthetic versions of opium that are not actually derived from the plant itself.
Hmm.
And those kind of work the same way. They do sort of the same thing in the brain, which is why they're called opioids. But oftentimes it's way more powerful than the kind of drugs that were available in the U.S. Civil War era. So maybe that cleared it up. Maybe that made it even more confusing. But the kind of words in practice, opioids, opium, morphine, oftentimes are used pretty interchangeably. So kind of referring to the same sorts of substances and the same sorts of biological processes that happen when you swallow them or smoke them or inject them.
Okay. And this would be, the Civil War would be considered pre-modern medicine, right? Like modern medicine is a 20th century sort of, or late 19th century, early 20th century, but like this is before that, so it's not
Yeah,
like their understanding of what opium was and what morphine and what it did was limited. Correct.
yeah, this is one of the other things that I find really fascinating about like this particular period of medicine. It's so different than what we would call modern medicine, our medicine, but it's also the U.S. Civil War, the 1860s, and kind of Reconstruction, the 1870s, are the last possible moment before modern medicine. And
Okay.
so the same doctors that are doctors during the Civil War kind of grow up doing what we might call pre-modern medicine, but they end their careers like later in the 1800s, early in the 1900s, doing modern medicine. And so that makes them think a lot about the kinds of treatments that they had provided to their patients in the early parts of their careers. So
Hmm.
those doctors get really, really introspective. And it makes the whole thing even more kind of confusing but exciting to research because you're operating sort of with two different versions of medicine, the modern and the pre modern.
I think it'll have more impact if we save some of that introspection for later in the episode, but I would love to
Cool.
get to that. That's really interesting.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I know there are a lot of misconceptions about Civil War medicine. I know
Mm.
one is, and I think it's not true, that they would give soldiers bullets to bite on whenever they were chopping off a limb, or they would give them alcohol. Would they give
Mm.
them opium? Where sort of during the Civil War is an opioid or opium something they would give to anyone at a field hospital, or you know give us an idea of what was going on as far as
Yeah,
medicine
John
and
has a
pain
headache. Does he need
control.
one? Like,
Right.
who's
Or
getting this in what
versus you
context?
lost your arm kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Anywhere you look during the Civil War, there's opium and morphine. I mean, it's like these substances are already really widely used before the Civil War. They're actually, by the time that the U.S. Civil War breaks out in 1861, they are some of the most commonplace medicines in America already. They're in like
Hmm.
roughly about half of all prescription drugs at that point contained opium and morphine.
They
But
just
as you
throw
can
it in there
imagine,
just
yeah, it's
as
just
a
kind of
little
mixed
extra
in there.
spice.
It works great, right? It helps with the pain. It also
True.
it's useful for treating like insomnia. You can imagine, but they even used it as a cough suppressant and even a medicine to treat diarrhea, cholera, things like that. And so. If we think about the Civil War, we think about gunshot wounds and amputations. We also think about things like camp sicknesses, kind of like GI symptoms, fevers, things like that. All of those are things that opium is used during the war as a medicine against. And so, let's say, random Union Army soldier gets shot at the Battle of Gettysburg, goes or is taken to a field hospital behind the lines, probably going to get a morphine shot. But also, if a soldier is, suffering from a bad cup of water and kind of the diarrhea that ensues from that, I know it's kind of gross, but that's sort of the reality during the Civil War.
Yeah.
They would also take opium for that, and so it just really, really widely used substances: opium, morphine, and also laudanum, the alcohol version of opium, which was especially a doozy for a lot of folks.
Well, it's like aspirin today, or
Yeah.
take an aspirin. Take some opium.
Just give
Exactly. Yeah, it's actually
Honey,
some of the only.
do we have any
painkillers
laudanum left?
available.
Where is it in the cabinet?
If only.
I need to
Wow.
go to the moon. Okay, so that makes sense. And did they have any understanding of addiction in this? I mean, obviously, people were like, I think this is probably, the word came along later, but like lushes and people who were like alcoholics, like they knew that alcohol was could be a problem in some form or fashion. Did they have an understanding of what addiction was?
Yeah, for sure. More so than I had anticipated when I started digging into this topic. I will say we know, like today, in 2025, we know a lot more about addiction than they knew addicted people and doctors that would kind of come into contact with them back in the 1860s and 70s. But they were familiar with the concept. They had the word addiction. It meant something comparable to how we mean it. The word wasn't as commonly used as other labels. For example, the title of the book is called Opium Slavery, which to be enslaved to opium was kind of a back then way of saying that you were addicted to it. A lot of what they knew came with comparisons to alcohol use. Alcohol use in the 19th century also off the charts. And so alcohol dependence, addiction, was really commonly understood. And so when folks started using opium heavily or over sort of a long term, they seemed to develop the same kind of dependence, but not to alcohol, to opium. And so that basically gave the idea to doctors sort of early in the 1800s that opium could be addictive. And so by the time that you sort of fast forward to the 1860s, it's actually widely known by American doctors and even by members of the public who would read about it in newspapers and things like that, that these drugs were addictive. And so, there's things they didn't understand about addiction. They didn't really understand how to treat it very well. The reason for that is that they weren't sure how opium worked in the body. Like, did it work in the brain? Did it work somewhere else? Those are things that we understand very well today, but not back then. And so some mysteries remained. They had to try to come up with ways to explain those mysteries. And that's a big part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, you're pre germ theory. You're like very, as far as like what the inner functionings of stuff happening is pretty, it would have been a total mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that their understanding back then, when I say there, I mean doctors, kind of people in the 1860s and 70s, their understanding of the body was a lot closer to sort of the medieval understanding of the body than it is to our understanding today of how the body works. And so it really is kind of like the last possible moment when you can do medicine in the pre-modern context. Because in the 1870s, 1880s, the germ is discovered. You have different theories of biology and the body kind of like articulated and gaining kind of mainstream acceptance. And so that changes the kind of medical understanding of addiction a lot as well.
So before we dive into the details of, the Civil War and this opium slavery, I found it very interesting in your book where you talked about who was considered an opium user prior to the Civil War, and then how the veterans changed the perception of the drug and of this addiction or opium slavery.
Yeah. So this was one of the other things that I had to really, that I puzzled over for a long time. Like, if people knew, even vaguely, but if they knew about addiction before the Civil War, how did they explain who used, who became addicted to opium when other folks didn't become addicted? And so the kind of like going theory before the Civil War was that if a person was weak, like if they were inherently weak, meaning they had kind of a frail body, or maybe they had mental illness, or maybe they were like morally weak, that weakness was a kind of predisposing factor that helped explain why they, in theory, became addicted. Whereas stronger people, like people with stronger bodies or stronger morals, right? They, again, according to kind of the pre-Civil War understandings of addiction, were more like immune to developing addiction, if that makes sense.
Right.
There were also race-based theories as well, and so this is where the story takes kind of like a turn for the worse in a lot of ways. Like it's really interesting to kind of think about and talk about sort of these to us kind of otherworldly understandings of medicine, but they also have kind of effects in our own times as well, especially when we talk about kind of the racism that was injected into medicine in the 1800s. One of the most common and kind of like widely believed theory is that certain races were supposedly prone more so than others to becoming addicted. And that was, again, kind of the belief before the Civil War. American doctors in particular thought that Chinese men and women were more likely to become addicted to opium than like white American men and women. And so when the Civil War changed that, when it started poking holes in that theory, because a lot of white male Civil War veterans got addicted, that was a really kind of distressing thought for a lot of people observing the opium crisis back then. It sort of poked holes in these kind of racial understandings of addiction.
Did that change in user base or addiction base, I suppose, um, change the moral perception of what it was like? Because you said that like, oh, a weaker person, an immoral person, or whatever. Did they adjust their perception of it rather than adjust their understanding of the drug rather?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. So I mean, Civil War veterans had like a really special place in kind of post-war society, right? They were
Mm.
sort of like kind of like the greatest generation of their time.
Hmm.
Whether, we're talking about the North or the South, Civil War veterans were like, oftentimes highly regarded in their communities. They were sort of like put up on a pedestal. Literally, by the end of the century, you have pedestals with statues of Civil War veterans on them. And so when those folks got addicted, as opposed to sort of people that were seen as weaker or racially other, that made more than a few, it made a lot of people kind of question these pre-war theories of addiction. They started to wonder, maybe addiction isn't kind of a moral weakness. If sort of the most moral person of the community can also get addicted, maybe we need to reevaluate that. And so a lot of folks, again, started to kind of question those pre war ideas. I think Civil War veterans themselves who used opiates and also who knew people like their old kind of comrades or maybe their old sergeant or whoever who was addicted to morphine, they also felt a lot of sympathy with those folks too. And so they kind of took a leading edge in calling for a reevaluation of some of these ideas of addiction.
Right. And I think you make a really, really good point in your book why you choose the Civil War veterans. But I think it's important that you share that with the audience because you use
Hmm.
200 Civil War veterans who became addicted. And I know you mentioned that that's the vast minority of people, in the country at the time that were addicted, and why you chose these individuals and how they shine a light on the rest of the country and the rest of addiction. And also, if you can throw in some of your sources, because you had some really amazing sources in your book as well, as a primary source nerd, and Isaac as well. We're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, I am too. I'm all about like trying to like compile as many of these sources as I can. But yeah, so I think so this was sort of a research puzzle for me too. I'm not the first, obviously, historian to be curious about opioids and about kind of medicine in the 19th century. And so other historians, before I started this project, had documented the phenomenon of addiction kind of in the 1800s, and they concluded that probably the vast majority of users of opiates back in the 1800s were not Civil War veterans. They were other people, right? They were
Mhm.
people who had never been in the army. Oftentimes, they were women who had been kind of prescribed opiates by their doctors for particular reasons. And so I was like, what's that got to do kind of with the Civil War? And so I was trying to kind of find a way to connect these two phenomenons, the war and kind of the medicine of the war, and what we already knew about the opioid crisis. And I realized that Civil War veterans were kind of the key. They could tell us a whole lot about kind of the experiences of the war. They're fascinating in their own right. But also, because they're so well documented, they can teach us a lot about other folks who were not Civil War veterans who used opiates back then. The government during the war and after the war kept meticulous data and records on Civil War veterans. They were poked and prodded and looked at and photographed, so much more so than other people after the Civil War. And so they can help us as subjects, right? Civil War veterans that used opiates can shine a lot of light on the facets of the topic that other subjects are not able to do because they're not as well documented.
Hmm.
And I guess I should also add that opiate addiction is so taboo back then, kind of like it still is today, although less so, I think, in our own times. But it's so taboo that most opiate users tried to keep it an ultra secret. Like they tried their
Mm.
hardest to avoid writing about the topic. They didn't want to disclose it to their doctors usually. And so other demographics of Americans, it's notoriously difficult to study them when we're talking about addiction. And so again, Civil War veterans, I think for me, are kind of like a window into this broader phenomenon. Plus, they're interesting in their own right.
Absolutely.
Just on a technical level, if they weren't getting it from their doctors, how did these folks that were addicted get a hold of this? If they can write about it, they can, like, were there dealers? I imagine it's a little bit different than what I'm imagining a drug
That's a good
dealer
question.
today.
Yeah, the dealers were the pharmacists, right? They were
Hmm.
also the post office,
Oh yeah.
the traveling kind of doctor that would roll into town, pop up shop, and then kind of leave the next day. The crazy thing for me that I learned about kind of the 1800s and sort of the context of opioids in the 1800s is that they were totally unregulated. There were almost no laws. That restricted the flow of dangerous substances, addictive substances. The 1800s is kind of famously the era when the temperance movement starts, kind of the movement to control addictive alcohol. So there were efforts made, kind of springing out of the temperance movement, to try to control poisons and other kind of narcotics like opium, but they
Hmm.
never really went anywhere until the 1910s. And so anybody, effectively, basically anybody that wanted opioids that could afford them in the 1800s could have access to these substances. And so that only fueled the potential for an opiate crisis.
Hmm.
Obviously, we know from our own times today, despite all of the many efforts to restrict opioids, these what historians call kind of supply side policies, like policies to kind of clamp down on the flow of substances, don't always work, right? So they don't completely defuse an addiction epidemic, but you can imagine what it's like in the 1800s without any restrictions at all. Like it's a really wild scenario. It's kind of like the Wild West of medicine, is how I think about it.
Right. And you always hear in the Civil War shortages in food, in arms, in clothing. Did they ever have a shortage of drugs as well?
Yeah, so it was kind of a split screen between the North and the South. Like with so
Ah.
many other things, the Union Army had like almost an unlimited supply of bullets and gunpowder and
Mm-hmm.
horses, clothing, and it's the same kind of situation with medicines. When there's a realization in 1861, especially in 1862, which is the year the war got really bloody for the first time, the Union government, the Union military realizes that it's going to need a whole lot more opium, way more morphine than it has access to. And so they set up these massive pharmaceutical laboratories to take imported opium poppies and turn them into just gargantuan quantities of opium and morphine. And the same with other medicines as well, like malaria drugs and things like that. In the South, the best way when shortages started to really come into effect, kind of because of the Union blockade in the South, about halfway through the war, the best way to get morphine actually became taking it from the Union Army. So Southern soldiers and cavalry would kind of go around raiding Union medical depots, taking the supplies and kind of distributing them throughout the Confederacy. The Confederacy also, and this is sort of like a weird kind of curiosity thing for me. I've always really wanted to know more about this, but the sources are really spotty. The Confederacy actually tried to convince civilians to grow opium poppies throughout the South and then donate them to the Confederate Army. And so, kind of
Wow.
a crazy story.
Oh, that's
Huh.
interesting.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to have taken off. It seems like most people that were able to continue doing farming in the Confederacy were really going all in on cotton and other things that
Hmm.
they could sell for a lot of money because the war caused inflation, right? Drove up prices. And
Right.
so you're being asked by the government to donate opium or you can sell cotton, right? So it's
Yeah.
like it didn't really work very well for the Confederacy, but they sure did try.
Right. Or feed yourself for the subsistence farmers. And even then
Exactly.
they were being raided by both armies when they came by and taking all of their food for that winter. So I can see why you just kind of roll your eyes and say, I'm not
Yeah.
growing poppies.
For sure. Yeah, it's really difficult to to do those kinds of things when you're trying to survive the middle of a war zone, right? So it's kind of
Right.
a crazy, crazy story.
Was there a specific place that the North was importing it from? Like, was it still like the Middle East or?
Yeah, most throughout throughout the 1800s, most opium actually came from abroad. So it was
Okay.
you could grow poppies in different parts of the United States. Periodically people tried to do so even before the Civil War. But it never really took off just because there were other things that were more profitable to grow. Again, during the war, before the war, and after the war. And so, just because of the price point, kind of the availability, most opium poppies and opium was imported. Back then, the big kind of like origin point tended to be Turkey. Turkey was famous for producing like the most potent opium poppies, and so that's what you wanted, right? Other places included China, and so famously, there's a
Hmm.
lot going on, or I guess kind of infamously, there's a lot going on with opium in China, and we could
Hmm.
talk more about that if we wanted to, as kind of a tangent. But some of the opium that is being trafficked kind of in China spills over into the United States. It's smuggled or kind of diverted into the United States. During the Civil War, India also became a major supplier of
Hmm.
opium. So we have kind of international ramifications. And so wherever it comes from, the Union tends to ship it through either California or New York City. And so New York City, being the closest kind of big city to the front, happened to be the site of the Union Army's pharmaceutical labs. And they also tried to do that in Philadelphia as well.
Interesting. That makes it seem like there had to have been some serious medical breakthroughs during the Civil War, because if you're spending that much time, even in just that, I imagine
Mhm.
it just seems like you're spending a lot of effort on understanding medicine and making medicine. Were there other, were they doing anything with any other medicine, or was it just like, it's all about opium?
As long as they mixed it with the opium, like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You want to put some opium in there and then it's going to be better no matter what,
yeah.
right?
Exactly. You can't go wrong.
It's kind of funny because I think a lot of times, in the movies, right, in the books, we think about Civil War medicine in very sort of brutal terms, and it was
Yeah.
like compared to the medicine that we all know. Thankfully, our surgical procedures are less brutal. Our experience with doctors is less like rough usually, and so that's not to say it wasn't. Civil War medicine wasn't brutal, but it was very scientific. It was a lot more
Hmm.
scientific than I think we give them credit for. American doctors looked at the Civil War and they saw it as a chance to learn more. Like they saw it as sort of a golden opportunity, really,
Yeah.
to discover new things, to try developing new procedures. Before the Civil War, if you wanted to become a doctor, basically you had to go to Europe to learn like the latest and greatest techniques and technology and ideas about the body, and then you would come back home and you would try to make a living doing that. And so the Civil War, with all these wounded and sick people, with these huge hospitals and pharmaceutical labs and things like that, really presents American doctors with kind of a homegrown opportunity to contribute to kind of the development of medicine. And they did. They learned a lot about the way that nerve injuries, for example, kind of work in the body.
Hmm.
Stuff that's kind of like above my head, right? Because I'm not a physician or a scientist, but they learned a lot about how nerve injuries work, how to
Hmm.
treat nerve injuries. They developed new, precise forms of amputation. They developed ways to help patients survive amputations even before antibiotics. And they also developed new ways of delivering opium and morphine. The old way before the Civil War, the most common method of taking opium was to literally swallow opium. And so, kind of an old timey way of describing an opium user is to call them an opium eater. And that's literally
Oh.
because you would
Hmm.
eat opium. Of course, we all know that opium can be smoked too. That
Hmm.
wasn't super common before the Civil War, became more common after the Civil War. But during the Civil War, American doctors for the first time realized that morphine, if it's delivered through a very new medical device called a hypodermic syringe, that was really cutting edge technology back then, that it worked like that. Like it worked really, really quickly, like the snap
Oh.
of your fingers,
Hmm.
as opposed to taking a while to kick in. And so you can imagine you're in the middle of a Civil War hospital, you've got 100 patients with
Hmm.
all kinds of traumatic injuries. You want that speedy pain relief. And so the practice of injecting morphine through syringes directly into the injured part of the body took off like wildfire during the Civil War. And then after the war, of course, that's what we do today. And so the war really
Yeah.
helped popularize the hypodermic syringe in the US as well.
So you're just describing such like a complex system of
Yeah.
of things happening and at such volume because there's
Mm.
so many people that are injured.
Hmm.
These hospitals, I'm assuming that are they run by the army? Like, is it the army, sort of like their military hospitals and institutions? Do any of them like stick around? Like, is this when a lot of like things stick around, or are they just all makeshift at the time? And this is not. It didn't become a foundation for further institutions.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a great question. And for me, this is really where my kind of like understanding of this, it helped me to actually go to some of these places and
Hmm.
figure this out. So Civil War hospitals were everywhere. They were all over the South, all over the North. They were in cities, they were in people's houses, they were in college campuses. And so a lot of them just popped up like grass.
Mm.
Some of them were temporary, and some of them were more permanent institutions that contributed to the kind of institutions, medical institutions that we have today. The pop up ones were usually called field hospitals. And so, if you are like on a battlefield and you have to get yourself or your buddy off to see a doctor, you're going to drag them over to a field hospital. And those would be like in a barn on the other side of the battlefield, like just
Sure.
anywhere that you could put people. If you survived a field hospital, you had a pretty good chance of being taken to one of the more permanent hospitals. And that's really where a lot of the surgeries would go down. And so you can imagine the level of opioid use in these bigger hospitals.
Yeah.
Some of the more kind of permanent hospitals in Washington, D.C., and Richmond and Philadelphia had thousands and thousands of patients at a time with hundreds of doctors and thousands of volunteers from all over the world and all over the country, certainly,
Huh.
working to kind of like do the medical help of the Civil War. So, a really unprecedented development. Hospitals before the Civil War tended to be really small. They were more like places where you would go to die rather than a place where you would go to
Right.
get healed. And that changes during the Civil War.
Interesting. That also makes it sound more like a, if not global, maybe Atlantic world type war, because I you always think of it as North versus South, and they're trying to get, Europeans to, at least the Confederacy is trying to get considered by Europeans, but the thought that there are volunteers from other countries coming over, learning medicine, sharing what they know, sort of a whole new perception of the Civil War that I hadn't thought about before.
For sure, yeah. I think kind of like the international aspect of the Civil War is something that we really do need to learn more about. We've learned a lot over the
Yeah.
last several decades,
Hmm.
but I think kind of like the international medical dimensions of the war is a topic that is we're desperate for more research on this. What we do know is that American doctors, American nurses also learned a lot abroad before the Civil War and took that
Hmm.
to the U.S. in the 1860s. Famously, the Red Cross is sort of born in Europe and brought to the United States. It's born out of European conflicts right before the Civil War, like the Crimean War, where a lot of the techniques that are applied in the US Civil War are sort of imported from. And so I think sometimes it's a kind of like an artificial thing to say that there's American medicine and European medicine, because back then there's a lot of cross pollination. And so I think
Hmm.
we should know a lot more about that. And I hope that we can learn more about that kind of moving forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to get to the moving past the actual Civil War, right?
Mm.
When people are getting a lot of this medication and becoming addicted,
Hmm.
how at what point did they realize that it was a problem? Like at what
Mm.
when did this sort of like and maybe my other question is like who was it the army going, uh-oh,
Right.
Or was it society at large that they were seeing these, their family members come home like in a different state,
Hmm.
horribly addicted to this medication? How did that
Yeah.
process take place?
Really quickly, really much more quickly
Mm.
than I had anticipated. These kinds of addiction epidemics are usually sort of slow moving. Kind of famously, if we compare kind of the Civil War epidemic to the opioid crisis that's still ongoing in the US today, the company kind of Purdue Pharma, which is sort of a big name in the modern opioid crisis, they made the drug OxyContin. They started marketing this drug in the mid 90s. Wasn't
Hmm.
really until the mid 2000s when there was a broad awareness that there was an opioid addiction epidemic that could be traced back to the 1990s. So that's kind of what I expected when I first started digging into the opioid crisis coming out of the Civil War. I thought it would take a while for anybody to really become aware of it. And so it would
Hmm.
be sort of a slow moving crisis. And that's the opposite of what I found. I found almost immediately coming out of the year 1865 into 66 and 67, kind of going into the early 1870s, that a lot of folks were very concerned about the problem of addiction among people who had survived the Civil War and also kind of people that had been living in the war zone. And so there was, I think, a widespread recognition that the war contributed to addiction almost immediately. One of my favorite examples is actually a novel. There were, kind of famously, the 1800s, there's not a lot to do. And so novels are really, really big. And so a really big form of entertainment. They oftentimes had to be written really quickly so that they could be kind of put out there into the world. And so they would take kind of their, material that they're writing about from whatever's going on around them. And that was true of the Civil War. One of the first novels to be published about drug use in the United States actually featured a drug addicted Civil War veteran, and it was published right after the Civil War.
Hmm.
Wow.
And so, really, really quickly, people are picking up on this. It's not just the doctors, even the novelists are realizing that there's an addiction problem kind of coming up out of the Civil War. It only gets bigger and bigger as
Hmm.
the post war decades pass by. And so the awareness grows and grows. Eventually, you have doctors that are concerned. They have conferences where they discuss the problem. The government gets concerned, especially when they start to see Civil War veterans who are applying for pensions and trying to get medical care. They're coming in. It's being discovered that they're opium and morphine users. That raises alarm bells. All kinds of different ways that people are realizing that there's a crisis, and pretty quickly after the war.
Hmm.
And we've talked about opium being given for physical issues, but
Mm.
I have to imagine post-war, I can't imagine anyone coming back and being the same. And when you think of, PTSD or what they've seen, what they've been through, was it ever prescribed? I imagine it was taken, but was it ever prescribed for something other than physical pain to try
Mm.
to assist in other ways for, veterans who've seen horrifying things?
Yeah, great question. Doctors were hesitant to prescribe opioids for people that were suffering from what we might call PTSD today. And so that
Mhm.
that label, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, didn't exist back then, but they had sort of other labels for those kinds of psychological issues. One was a condition called irritable heart, which is discovered by a Civil War surgeon or named by a Civil War surgeon who was kind of studying sort of the mental health of Civil War soldiers and veterans. And so he specifically recommended that folks who were suffering from, again, this disease that he called irritable heart,
Mhm.
kind of like a back then way of saying PTSD. He said that they should not be given opium because they might take too
Oh.
much of it and get
Hmm.
addicted.
Mm.
On the other hand, people that were actually suffering from those problems that couldn't sleep because of the scenes that they saw at Shiloh, which is kind of a famous example of a Civil War author called Ambrose Bierce wrote about kind of like how his experience at this battle in 1862 haunted him. People who were like that, they almost instinctually reached for opium and morphine to try to help themselves. And so if the doctors are saying no, people shouldn't be taking this for anxiety or for mental illness, people themselves, like former soldiers, felt the opposite. And so you have sort of a kind of like a 180 there, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. And I should also say, I don't actually have any evidence that Ambrose Bierce was an opium or morphine user. So I wouldn't want anybody to take away that impression.
Right.
But he kind of famously was able to voice things that a lot of Civil War veterans didn't have words to kind of articulate. And so that's kind of why I used that example.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, when it's starting to be recognized as a problem, what did
Mhm.
they do about it? Was it, hit the person with a stick till they stop? I don't like.
Yeah.
Was there a more
Yeah.
sophisticated sort of structural approach to it? Like, hey, we need to get these guys help, or is it,
Yeah.
that's between you and God? Go to church, pray. How
Yeah.
did people try to solve this problem?
Yeah, the stick thing and the church thing are two two examples that they tried.
Oh, I was
I
fully
mean,
kidding, by the way.
yeah. No, it's kind of if the if kind of going back to what we had said earlier about how opioids are not very regulated at all, not very controlled in the 1800s. The same thing kind of goes for responses to addiction.
Hmm.
There's not like a framework or a structure there to help people that have substance use issues, right? Substance use, what we would today call substance use disorders or addictions. And so a lot of times people's family members would try to step in. Doctors would get involved sometimes. People, a lot of the times, would end up in jail, even though drug use and drug kind of like selling and buying wasn't illegal. Other things would happen, and sometimes people would end up in jail where the kind of warden would have to decide what to do. A lot of people ended up being institutionalized.
Hmm.
It was a really common view among doctors, especially after the Civil War, that addiction was linked to mental illness, that opioid use could drive you insane. They had different labels for this. Some doctors called it morphiomania, and so they really struggled to like name this kind of like link between addiction and mental illness that they were perceiving. But in any case, a lot of people ended up in these mental asylums, which were sort of like jails. And so a
Hmm.
lot of bad
Mm.
things could happen to you, in other words, if it was known that you were an opioid user back then. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why people tried to keep it close to the chest and not let very many people know about it. The temperance movement was particularly interested in like a religious solution. So
Mm.
that's kind of where, going back to the thing that you had just said,
Hmm.
Isaac, I found examples where at sort of like temperance meetings, they would bring out somebody who claimed to have been an opioid user in the past, who then kind of like prayed away the addiction and then they were
Mm.
cured, right? And so that was kind of one common approach to it.
Hmm.
I think that we should treat those cases with a degree of skepticism because that's not really how addiction works, right? Like,
Yeah.
again, we know a lot more about it than people did back in the 1800s. And so I find those cases hard to believe. I do think we should take them seriously, though, because it speaks to the kind of desperation of post Civil War society to deal with this problem, to try to find a solution to help people that are struggling with opioid use. They also came up with strategies that really mirrored the kinds of things that are done in modern drug rehabs. So
Mhm.
today we have different ways of kind of like treating addiction. One of those ways is to sort of like slowly taper the dose of an opioid down, as opposed to doing sort of what's called a cold turkey withdrawal approach,
It's
right?
going to be called titrating. Is that what it's called? Where you sort of
Yeah,
like, yeah,
titrating, right.
titrating. Yeah.
And so they kind of came up with the same thing back in the 1800s. People had kind of played around with that method of helping treat someone's addiction before the Civil War, but there weren't that many like examples of that being successful before the Civil War. After the war, there were whole medical societies that devoted themselves to kind of perfecting this method.
Hmm.
And so that was a really common treatment in mental asylums when someone would get institutionalized, like legally kind of like bound into the asylum. That's something that was done to them, sometimes more successfully than others. When it was done over the long term, it tended to work better, I've found in the records. I think one of the sadder stories, though, that comes out of this kind of Civil War era opioid crisis are the stories of people whose families would try to step in
Mm.
and do something about kind of their loved one's addiction. Families were highly, highly motivated to try to help or to try to fix their Civil War veterans problems partly for economic reasons. It's a
Mm.
really agricultural society. And if you've got a family member that can't work, that's kind of like draining the family's income on morphine, things like that, that's a problem. Also, the social stigma really contributes to this. And families could be kind of cruel, like to sort of put it in our own terms, they could be pretty cruel to their Civil War veteran loved ones. I found multiple examples where families would kind of like beat or put in chains their loved ones who had addictions. One of the stories that really sticks out in the book for me is the story of a guy called John Gulrick, who is a Confederate veteran whose family literally took him out to a farmhouse kind of on the outside of town where no one would hear him scream. They literally locked him in a closet and forced him to come off of morphine cold turkey, which can actually
Huh.
kill you. Like it can
Yeah.
really be a disaster. Lots and lots of pain involved. John Gulrick tried to break out at one point, and so they started posting a guard outside the door to keep him there. And you can kind of imagine what that would be like. So
Huh.
all of that is to
Uh,
say, kind of short version, responses were not great, and they could range from not great to really, really, really bad and dangerous.
that reminds me of that. I think it's just one scene in The Last Samurai
Mm,
where Tom Cruise is trying to get off of alcohol,
yeah,
and they basically like do that. They lock him in a closet. He just just screams to himself
yeah,
for hours, hours, hours. That's
yeah, and
brutal.
that's
It's interesting
it's
that you use the word cruel with the families, and not saying that
mm,
that the other situations weren't cruel, but it's
Right.
interesting that it feels worse when it's your family. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? Like that like coming across that treatment of someone like by family
yeah,
members feels worse than it's if the same thing was happening in an institution. Like of course
Right.
they're cold and
absolutely,
calculated, but if
yeah.
it's like your cousins and you're like that's awful.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, you expect the doctors at a 1800s mental asylum to be brutal,
Right.
just because of
Right.
kind of like what we know about these places. But we don't expect someone's, wife or their brother or their sister-in-law to lock them in a closet and be so hardcore in
Yeah.
their treatment method. And so that's part of the reason why those stories, especially the story of the Gulricks, really lodged itself in my mind. I keep kind of
Huh.
coming back to that.
Yeah, it seems like there's quite a bit of victim blaming and blaming the person on the medicine who,
Mhm.
for their addiction. And I want to ask, did that ever end? I know it
Mhm.
didn't end because it still exists today, but did that ever maybe turn a corner and become at least balanced, that they weren't blamed by everyone, or that people took a more rational kind approach?
Mm.
Yeah, if you don't mind me expanding that question a little bit, because you talked about
Mhm.
that crisis in the past tense. So like
Mhm.
it happened with
Right.
it, how did this like, yeah, how did the whole thing of this come to a close? Like how did this chapter come to a close? Obviously it didn't finish. The story is still ongoing of
Right.
the relationship with us and these kinds of medicines, but how did this part of stuff come to an end?
So basically, what ends up happening is that if we kind of look at the 1800s as a whole, addiction becomes pretty common around the middle of the century, especially after the Civil War. Stays at a relatively high rate until about the 1890s. And then we know from the work of other historians as well that the addiction crisis gets so big, attracts so much attention that drastic measures are taken. And that
Mhm.
helped kind of the epidemic sort of decline starting in the 1890s into the early 1900s. And so part of the reason for that is that doctors became really, really worried that they were going to get blamed for it, that they were going to get blamed for causing their patients, whether they were veterans or other people, to get addicted to opium and morphine. And so doctors started relying much less heavily on these addictive substances.
Mhm.
Other factors like age also came into play. Civil War veterans, by the time that you get to the early 1900s, a lot of them have died off. And so they became less common just overall, but especially addicted veterans were less commonly encountered sort of in the 1900s, the early 1900s. And so the crisis itself, whether it's through doctors' prescriptions that had been contributing to the crisis, or through the characters of Civil War veterans themselves who are sort of slowly disappearing over time, sort of takes a back seat to other drug crises. And so, for example, heroin. Heroin is a much more potent form of an opioid than morphine. It's extremely powerful. It's very addictive, just like opium or morphine. After the year 1900, heroin use becomes a much more common topic of conversation than Civil War morphine users. So they start to seem like kind of like old timey characters compared to the new kind of like generation of people that use heroin. And so a lot of the public scrutiny on addiction gets shifted from sort of the older folks to the newer kind of seemingly more dangerous users of heroin. And so at that point, it's like 1910, the 1910s, 1920s, then the federal government starts passing laws that heavily restrict the buying and selling of narcotics like heroin and also opium and morphine. And so that helps, again, even uh, to further kind of combat this addiction epidemic. Of course, we all know drug addiction doesn't go away. Neither does the victim blaming that kind of comes out of the 1800s. I think for me, that's one of the big legacies of the 1800s history of drugs, is that a lot of times when we talk about drug addiction, when we think about drug addiction today, we're mirroring a lot of the discourse that comes out of the 1800s, the victim blaming and things like that. There was another part of your question, and I forgot what it was. Maybe you could remind me.
Lynn's first part was sort of talking about how perceptions potentially changed, like where
Yeah.
as time went on, as far as the people's
Blaming them, like it's
yeah,
their
that
fault that
victim
they
blaming
are still
thing.
taking the
Yes.
medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So the victim blaming in a lot of quarters, like according to a lot of people, they always see it that way, and they continue.
Hmm.
Many of them kind of continue to see it that way forever. They never change their mind. A lot of people did change their mind when Civil War veterans kind of started advocating for themselves and advocating for other veterans for more
Yes.
sympathy. Many people became really sympathetic, and they were like, "Yeah, we can understand how an amputee, who was prescribed morphine at Vicksburg or wherever, could have a morphine problem today, and so we should do something to help them rather than to
Hmm.
punish them." Doctors were especially likely to be in that corner. Doctors who treated addiction specifically started advocating for kind of a model, like an understanding of addiction that took all of the sort of morality and victim blaming out of it and framed addiction exclusively as a brain disease. Back then, they called it a disease, they called it inebriety. And so that word today, inebriation, that's where that comes from.
Oh.
And so you kind of get traces of that today. That is a common way of talking about addiction late in the 1800s and early in the 1900s. It never really catches on among everyone, right? So veterans kind of feel that way. A lot of doctors start to feel that way. The government is kind of in a mixed bag, right? So some
Hmm.
government officials that are responsible for kind of like welfare programs that deal with veterans are sympathetic. Others are definitely not sympathetic, and they try to go out of their way to kind of victim blame addicted veterans. But there is a lot more sympathy after the Civil War for drug users than before. I will say that the sympathy doesn't last very long. In the 1920s, kind of famously, the 1920s is the era of prohibition.
Hmm.
Most people know that there's a constitutional amendment that tries to kind of ban and eradicate alcohol use in the United States. Obviously, that doesn't go super well. Al Capone and all those kinds of
Right.
things, and then eventually that amendment is sort of taken away and replaced with another amendment. And now we have booze today. It's great. But there's a similar there's a similar kind of parallel with drugs. In 1914, the
Yeah.
federal government passes a law for the first time that tries to control the flow of narcotics. It's called the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, and so that heavily restricted the availability of narcotics in the U.S. And so there was a real supply crunch. It also meant that people who tried to evade the tax and buy basically black market narcotics could go to jail for the first time
Sure.
in a big way. And so that kind of re-stigmatized addiction. When you get addiction and addicted people coming into contact with police and with jails, even more
Hmm.
so than before, it takes some of that sympathy that comes out of the Civil War era's opioid crisis and throws it in the trash can and kind of re-stigmatizes addiction in a way.
And I realize this isn't, yeah, you're talking about the Civil War veterans, but I'm
Mhm.
wondering, all of these things you're talking about, the growing sympathy and the changes, was this across the board, regardless of race, and if it's
Mm.
man or woman, men or women, or is it just the, sort of white Civil War veterans that we're talking about that get the sympathy, whereas maybe someone else isn't given that benefit of the doubt?
Yeah, so we can imagine that in a society that was heavily ordered by race and by class and by gender, that there would be differences, right, in how
Hmm.
people who use opiates, who come from all demographics, but how they're treated differently based on their identity, and that's certainly the case in the kind of post-Civil War era.
Hmm.
It's especially true when we compare like white male Civil War veterans versus Chinese immigrants, and so
Hmm.
starting in the really not starting in the 1800s, but kind of really coming to an inflection point in the 1880s with the passage of bans on Chinese immigration into the United States. The media, people who were like diehard white supremacists, people that opposed immigration, tended to talk a whole lot about opioid use among Chinese immigrants and not so much opioid use among Civil War veterans. And there's a reason for that, right? These their racial biases really affected how they thought about and treated opioid users based
Hmm.
on who the user was.
Right.
And so we've been talking mostly about like opium eating, morphine injecting. Opium smoking actually gets criminalized very early on after the Civil
Hmm.
War, but only among Chinese immigrants, right? So
Oh.
it's much more heavily policed among Chinese immigrants than among Civil War veterans, for example. And so to kind of circle back around to your question, Lynn, the identity of the person using the opioid uh, absolutely matters when we're talking about the kinds of things that might happen to that person in the 1800s.
Now, did you say that it's more heavily policed or was just explicitly illegal just for Chinese immigrants?
Mm. It's complicated, right? This is the the annoying like historian thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
when so kind of in the context of like anti-Chinese immigration laws and Jim Crow, kind of in the 1880s and the 1890s, when there would be a lot of media attention fixated on issues of race and kind of discourse around white supremacy, things like that in the newspapers, suddenly there would be police raids on Chinese opium dens, and
Hmm.
then the kind of media fixation would shift to something else. The police would
Hmm.
kind of step away for a while, and that cycle would sort of repeat itself. So it's not that there was sort of like a blanket ban on all Chinese immigrants smoking opium. It was really a ban that was heavily affected by whatever was happening in the news in any given year.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Another example of that, to kind of, since you mentioned it, are laws that were passed by states like California, also by Texas, that didn't ban opium smoking, but rather gathering to smoke opium in a Chinese owned establishment.
Oh.
And so it's really
Wow.
complicated. But again, it just goes back to the point that Lynn had just been asking about. The kind of like way that people respond to addiction is so heavily dependent on the context and the identity of the user.
Hmm.
Yeah, this is as long ago as the topic that we're talking was. I mean, we're talking over 100 years ago. We're coming towards the end of our hour here, but
Mhm.
just to say that a lot of what we've just talked about is disconcertingly familiar
Hmm.
in a very upsetting way.
Yep.
But we have one final question that we normally ask like all of our guests, and I'm actually curious to know what your answer to this is going to be. We like to get our listeners out of their off of their couch, out of their homes to go see some historical site or a museum or something like that. Is there any place that people might be able to go visit to learn more about this history or the history of medicine of the era that was particularly relevant to your research?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have to give a plug here to some of my colleagues that run the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, which is in Frederick, Maryland.
Yes.
a hospital town during the Civil War. They have collections of all different kinds of Civil War medical artifacts that you can go, you can interact with them. I recommend doing it before lunch. It can get pretty wild. But yeah, if you want to learn more about not just addiction, but also any kind of Civil War medical topic you can think of, like amputations, medical photography, medical microscopes that they used in
Mm,
Army research labs back then. This is like the destination where you want to go and do that. So it's a really, really great place if you want to, go from listening to a podcast to visiting a site. That's a place that I would highly recommend. There's another museum in Richmond called the American Civil War Museum. It's on the site of a munitions factory in what used to be the Confederate capital, and they also have great medical exhibits in addition to other things that you can see and listen to learn about kind of the common soldier's experience during the Civil War.
Hmm.
that's fantastic.
Oh, that's a great recommendation.
Yeah, I wish I could
Absolutely.
say to visit one of these kind of Civil War pharmaceutical labs. Sadly, they don't exist anymore, and I actually can't find them on a map. So that's kind of like the next
Oh,
sort of like missing piece that I want to solve. Where are these, where are
Where
these
were they?
pharmaceutical labs? Like,
Yeah.
how can I visit like the old ruins of them or something? So that's
I
what I'll
for
be up to after this.
Oh,
I
well, you have to
foresee
let us
like
know
a
if you find them.
possible, yeah, I
Yeah.
foresee like a possible reality show of history's
Yeah.
mysteries and trying to find.
Yeah, absolutely.
Always trying to give historians television shows. Can anybody, so your book is coming out in October, and depending on when this is released, we'll make sure we have a link to either pre-order or to order your book. But if people want to find you online, are you on any social media? Do you have a website? Where can they find you?
Yeah, so I use Blue Sky, the social media app. So I'm on there a lot, kind of commenting about sort of all different things history, not just opioids, but really anywhere where history kind of meets sort of the news is kind of what I talk about on there.
Yeah.
I have a website where folks can go and read some of the other research projects that I've done and that I've done with some of my students and other folks.
Mhm.
And so I can we could add that link to the episode notes.
Absolutely.
And I can always I'm always happy to chat with people. I actually really enjoy chatting with people that are interested in Civil War medicine by email. So folks can send me an email at Jones Jones 8js at jmu.edu.
Perfect. We'll put all of that in the show notes.
Excellent.
That's one. You are wonderfully accessible. I'd
Yes.
say as a scholar. That's great. And as always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon, where you can, if you become a member there, you can join our community and sometimes get some behind the scenes access to additional materials and also potentially some community book giveaways from books from by some of the authors that we talked to. Maybe this one at some point in the future. But yeah, you can go check that out at patreon.com/primary source media. Thanks so much, Dr. Jones. This was awesome.
It was.
Genuinely a really, really fascinating conversation.
Thank you so
Yeah, thank you
much.
so much for having me.